I wanted to thank everybody for being here and for providing the input you did. Not just the people who were in the courtroom here, but also those who provided written statements, both from the Floyd family and the defendant's family. I've read all the impact statements that were submitted earlier and listened carefully to all the input.
Welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into an intense and controversial topic. Cases where killers, standing trial for their heinous crimes, were killed right in the courtroom. These are stories that blur the line between justice, revenge, and tragedy. That some of the content in this video may be disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. The case of George Gibson. The executioner becomes the executed. Our first story takes us to a small town in Ohio, where George Gibson, a man convicted of multiple murders, met a swift and brutal end during his sentencing trial. Gibson had been found guilty of murdering 3 local residents in cold blood. The victims were beloved community members, and their deaths left a deep scar on the town. On the day of Gibson's sentencing, the courtroom was packed with the victims' families, friends, and community members. The tension was palpable. As the judge prepared to hand down the life sentence, something unexpected happened. One of the victim's family members, sitting quietly in the courtroom, suddenly stood up. Without warning, he pulled out a concealed weapon and fired multiple shots directly at Gibson. The court erupted into chaos. Security rushed to restrain the shooter, but it was too late. Gibson was dead. The room was filled with a mix of relief and shock. Some of the spectators applauded the vigilant justice, while others were horrified by the violent scene that had unfolded before their eyes. This incident raises critical questions about courtroom security and the emotional toll that these kinds of cases can take on victims' families. Could this tragedy have been avoided? Was this act of violence justified in any way, or was it simply another senseless killing? The tragic death of Rick Williams, a father's revenge. In this next case, we see how grief and rage can drive a parent to extreme lengths. Rick Williams had been on trial for the murder of a young girl, an unspeakable crime that left a family devastated. The young victim's father, consumed by grief and anger, was in the courtroom for every session of the trial, unable to bear the sight of the man who had stolen his daughter's life. Williams, a remorseless killer, showed no sign of regret during the proceedings, and this only fueled the father's rage. As the trial came to a close, with Williams almost certain to be sentenced to life in prison, the grieving father made a deadly decision. He had secretly smuggled a firearm into the courtroom, determined to take matters into his own hands. During the sentencing hearing, the father stood up and, without hesitation, fired at Williams. Court officers tried to intervene, but the shots were fatal. Williams died instantly, collapsing in front of the stunned courtroom. The father was immediately subdued and arrested, but the atmosphere in the room was one of somber understanding rather than outrage. Many sympathized with the father, understanding the depth of this pain and the need for closure, even though his actions had crossed a line. This case became a focal point for debates about the emotional impact of trials on the families of victims. While the father's actions were illegal, many questioned whether the justice system had adequately served him. Did he truly believe that life in prison was enough of a punishment for the man who took his child? And what happens when the law doesn't bring the closure that grieving families desperately seek? The death of Mark Reynolds, mob justice in the courtroom. Mark Reynolds was a notorious serial killer, convicted of murdering 6 people over the course of 5 years. His trial was a media sensation, with reporters from across the country covering the case. Reynolds was arrogant and defiant throughout the proceedings, showing no remorse for his victims or their grieving families. The trial was lengthy, and tensions ran high as Reynolds' defense team fought tooth and nail to keep him off death row. As the jury returned with a guilty verdict and the judge prepared to sentence Reynolds to life in prison, the courtroom reached a breaking point. A group of men, believed to be relatives of the victims, had quietly formed a plan. They smuggled weapons into the courtroom and waited for the right moment. As the sentence was announced, these men rose from their seats and unleashed a barrage of gunfire on Reynolds. The killer was hit multiple times and died instantly in the chaos. Spectators screamed as security officers tackled the men and disarmed them, but the damage was done. Reynolds' death sparked a national conversation about the dangers of mob justice. While many saw his death as a fitting end for a man who had caused so much suffering, others were disturbed by the vigilant violence that had taken place in what was supposed to be a place of law and order. The court is meant to be a symbol of justice, not revenge, and this case raised serious concerns about the breakdown of that distinction. The case of Jonathan Burns, a killer's final moments. Jonathan Burns was a career criminal who had spent most of his life in and out of prison. But his most notorious crime, the brutal murder of a young woman, landed him on trial for his life. Burns was known for his erratic behavior and violent outbursts, both inside and outside the courtroom. His trial was marred by constant disruptions, with Burns frequently lashing out at witnesses, attorneys, and even the judge. During one particularly tense moment in the trial, Burns lunged at a court officer, attempting to grab the officer's weapon. In the ensuing struggle, a gunshot rang out, and Burns was fatally wounded. The courtroom fell silent as Burns collapsed to the floor, his life ending in the same violence that had defined it. This case is unique in that Burns' death was not the result of premeditated vigilant justice, but rather a tragic consequence of his own violent actions. Still, it raises important questions about courtroom security and whether more could have been done to prevent the escalation of violence.
We the people deserve better.
But he's immediately taken away by the court officer. And Judge Barry gets the final word.
Should there have been better measures in place to protect everyone involved, including the defendant? And how do we as a society balance the need for justice with the need for safety in the courtroom? The death of Carlos Mendez. A mother's heartbreak leads to tragedy. Carlos Mendez had been convicted of the brutal assault and murder of a young boy in Texas. The case had gripped the nation, with many calling for the harshest possible sentence. Mendez showed no remorse throughout the trial, smiling and even laughing at times as the prosecution described the horrific details of his crime. The young boy's mother attended every day of the trial, barely able to contain her grief and anger. On the day of sentencing, as the judge prepared to hand down Mendez's life sentence, the mother stood up, walked toward Mendez, and pulled out a knife she had hidden in her clothing. Before anyone could react, she stabbed Mendez multiple times, killing him on the spot. The courtroom erupted into chaos as officers subdued the mother and medics rushed in to confirm Mendez's death. The scene was heartbreaking as the mother, now in handcuffs, sobbed uncontrollably. The grief of losing her child had driven her to commit an act of violence that would change her life forever. This case became a symbol of the intense emotional trauma that families endured during these trials. It also sparked debates about whether the legal system does enough to support victims' families. Could this tragedy have been avoided if the mother had received better psychological support throughout the trial? And does the legal system truly understand the emotional toll that these cases take on those left behind? The broader implications: justice, revenge, and courtroom security. As we reflect on these tragic and shocking cases, it's clear that the intersection of justice and revenge is a complicated one. The court is meant to be a place where the law prevails and where justice is delivered in a fair and orderly manner. But when emotions run high and the pain of loss is overwhelming, the boundaries between justice and revenge can blur. One of the most glaring issues these cases raise is courtroom security. How were weapons smuggled into the courtroom in the first place? And why weren't the emotional states of these family members taken into greater consideration when planning for security? Another major question is about the nature of justice itself. Is life imprisonment or even the death penalty enough of a punishment for those who commit such horrific crimes? Or does the urge for revenge stem from a belief that the justice system fails to deliver true closure? Lastly, these cases highlight the need for greater psychological support for victims' families during the trial process. The emotional toll of sitting through a trial, reliving the details of a loved one's death, and facing the person responsible can be unbearable. Without proper support, families may feel that the only way to find peace is by taking matters into their own hands, with tragic results.